All right. Good afternoon, good evening, magandang araw, buenos dias, buenas noches, wherever you are. Wherever you're joining us today. Kasama po natin, we're today with a good friends of ours, Greg Pauling, joining us from Washington, D.C., right? Or where are you based now, Greg?
Pretty close. I'm in Baltimore, a little bit outside the city.
Okay, just a train ride. Anyway, somewhere
right.
there near the modern Rome, right? The capital of the modern empire. Okay, thank you, Greg, for joining us. It's really a pleasure to have you with us, especially, of course, with your new book, Hitting the Road.
Hey, thanks so much, Richard. It's always a pleasure.
So, Greg, first of all, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? I mean, you're a little bit, I would say, overexposed in some circles, including in my university of the Philippines. A lot of experts, a lot of policymakers I've talked to in the Philippines and the region are familiar with you, with your works, some more impressed than others for understandable reasons. But can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did an American like you get interested in Southeast Asia, for that matter, and later on South China Sea, the topic of your new book, of course, that we'll discuss today?
Well, at the beginning, at least, it was accidental. I thought I was a China expert like everybody else in the world at the moment. So I had done focused on China in undergrad. I had lived, studied at Fudan University in Shanghai and taught English in China. And then when I decided to go to graduate school for international relations, that's what I thought I was going to do. So I came in doing my language exams in Mandarin and but I had my first professor in graduate school happened to be Malaysian American, Pek Boon Hang, and she gave us more Southeast Asia than you might expect in an Intro to Asian IR class. And next thing you know, 2 years later, I'm doing my thesis on Indonesia and working at the Southeast Asia team at CSIS instead of the China team. And the rest is history.
Wow, we'll discuss the rest. Don't worry. I had no idea your background was in Fudan. Oh, that's very interesting. So you were a China studies guys before you got really more involved with Southeast Asia. I had no idea about that. Sorry, Greg. I mean, this is news flash to me, even though we have known each other for many years.
So, yeah, no problem. I mean, I wasn't IR poli-sci though. I was a history and philosophy major who did China, so it wasn't relevant to anything.
Right. Well, I have a couple of Hegel and our good friends here. If you want to discuss history philosophy, so. Yours is quite an interesting one, although not totally unique, I would say. We know a lot of folks, including Professor Shamba, among others, who have been China folks, and then they kind of diversified across the region. But of course, I mean, I don't think he ever claimed to be a Southeast Asia expert. But in your case, Greg, I mean, I've been following your works, your tweets. We have been conversing throughout the years and decades. And what I noticed is that you're actually passionate about the Southeast Asian region. I mean, you get down into the weeds. You know the latest, what we call marites or chismis, the latest gossips in court politics from, I don't know, Malacanang to other capitals in Southeast Asia. What was it about Southeast Asia that enticed you to not move away from China per se, but kind of expand your horizons beyond China?
At the beginning, I think it was the dynamism of the region. Why work on one country when you can work on 10? One country with a singular one-party state that doesn't change very quick versus 10 very diverse countries, most of which, at least at that time, were either consolidating or transitioning to democracy. Some have backslid since then, but it was just a more interesting region for me conceptually. And then I have been doing the South China Sea work in particular for 10 years because I had kind of a nerdy personal interest in international law. And I found the South China Sea to be one of the foremost issues where you kind of have a very clear answer, right? It's a bit of a puzzle. Like there's a right and a wrong, and everybody not based in Beijing knows which side is wrong, and yet that doesn't actually solve the issue. So I found the South China Sea at the beginning and a puzzle that I had to unpack.
Right. So again, we're joining now Greg Pauling for some of the folks who are joining us live, and they're asking like, who am I talking to? It seems to be very interested. By the way, later on, folks, you're free to ask your questions. We'll get it straight to Greg Pauling. how did you get interested in South China Sea? Was it because of the immediacy of the issue? Because it was picking up just when you were getting more interested in the region? Because that's also essentially how I got into the South China Sea business, right? 2011, 2012. That's essentially when things were picking up, right?
Yeah, it was the same time period for me. So we had done a little bit of South China Sea work in grad school, but it was kind of a back burner issue still at that time, right? I
Yep,
mean, we
yep.
had the Jasomia with U.S. With China, Philippines, and Vietnam had just ended. Everybody assumed that the DOC, the Declaration of Conduct, was managing the tensions. It wasn't at the top of the priority list of things that we were working on Southeast Asia at the CSIS Southeast Asia program anyway. But we had the South China Sea portfolio, and I was the only one on the team who knew GIS, knew the mapping piece. So they kind of stuck me with it in 2011, 2012. And then Scarborough Shoal hit shortly after I had gotten the portfolio. And it's been a consistent part, at times the lion's share of what I do for the last 10 years.
Right. And this, it did the Scarborough Shoal incident kind of, how do I like stare you in in the eyes and kind of say, hey, we have to get to know what's going on between Philippines and US, right? I think a big part of that crisis was also it exposed a lot of, let's say, holes as far as the Philippine-US alliance is concerned, right? I mean, this is what I noticed also in your writings and reflections.
I think that's probably right. So when I started at CSIS and started professionally working Southeast Asia, I didn't focus on the Philippines. My focus was primarily Indonesia and to a lesser extent Vietnam. But clearly these days, most of what I do is the Philippines, and that's been true for probably the last 7, 8 years. And the failures of both of our governments at Scarborough Shoal helped put me on that path. I mean, I came around, and I still firmly believe that for the U.S., your Southeast Asia strategy has to start with your oldest ally. If you don't get the Philippines right, you can't get anything else right in the region.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I want to push you on that because I see a lot of American folks very interested in China or very interested in Thailand. Let's call it the more exotic countries in the region. But for some reason, the Philippines, it never really enticed folks in DC as much as it should have, right? I mean, I noticed that myself throughout the years. And then, of course, Duterte happened, kind of changed things or kind of not. What about you? How did you come into this? Like, oh, Philippines, just some former colony we had there and like, oh, lots of problems. Yeah. I mean, how did you approach it, honestly? I mean, as an American, as far as the Philippines is concerned, yeah.
And so the entree for me was the South China Sea disputes. I wasn't really a security scholar, though. That was never why I got into this. I mean, I get tagged that way because that's what AMTI does. But my background in graduate school was focused on democracy and governance issues. And I was a history major before that. So when I started working in the South China Sea, it was more about international law and international norms. And the U.S.-Philippine alliance fascinates me as an American because it's a significant chunk of American history that we choose to have collective amnesia about. Whereas in the Philippines, you don't get to have collective amnesia about the colonial period. It stares you in the face all the time. For most Americans, if you're lucky, you can learn about it in graduate school and not before. And so if we're going to build an entire Indo-Pacific strategy, and part of that's the South China Sea strategy, at the heart of which is this alliance that is, other than NATO, the oldest U.S. security alliance in the world, I think Americans need to get a hell of a lot better about their own history and understanding where the alliance came from, why it's so conflicted and complicated, and build on it from there.
Right. Now, shortly, we'll get to your excellent new book and discuss what got you to write that excellent book and why do you think it truly matters, considering everything. But before that, was there something that amused and shocked and horrified you when you had a situation in 2016 when both our countries elected really outside the box leaders, each of whom introduced an element of shock to our foreign policy and also our alliance by that matter? How did you process that?
Well, so when it happened on your side in June, July,
few months earlier,
I got to have some distance from it, right? So it was analytically frustrating, particularly on July 12th, 2016, when the arbitral award came out. And that very morning, 6 countries hailed the award, and none of the 6 were the Philippines. That was a little frustrating. For somebody who had been working the South China Sea issues. It was much more personal on my side, obviously. I probably spent part of November 2016 with a hangover. But then you get back to work, and one of the interesting shifts for AMTI was that for the first 2 or so years of the initiative, from 2014 to 2016, it was really about helping drive US policy by highlighting in more or less real time things that China was doing, particularly the island building campaign, in ways that motivated US policymakers to do more.
Yeah.
From 2016 until at least 2020, AMTI's mission accidentally became about forcing the Philippine government to do more, because we didn't change what we were doing.
Which earned you a lot of friendships. Yeah.
Well, it earned me a lot of friendships outside of Malacanang. It didn't earn me any within Malacanang, and it made me persona non grata within DFA for probably 2 years. But I mean, look, it wasn't that we changed what we did, but naturally, if your mission is transparency and publicizing Chinese bad behavior, then you're going to piss off the people who don't want to talk about Chinese bad behavior. And particularly when Yasai and Cayetano were Secretary of Foreign Affairs, the operating assumptions in Manila were that we should not talk about the South China Sea at all, which really became absurd. For instance, after the Jember incident in 2019, like, we're publishing data about how this vessel is a militia vessel, and the Philippine government is trying to blame Filipino fishermen for getting run into, I suppose. So that all shifted back after 2020, when the Duterte government started letting up and they allowed DFA and D&D to do what they wanted to do. But for a while there, AMTI was in this weird position of accidentally having an adversarial relationship with the Philippine government.
You were kind of like the Rappler of the think tanks in the DC, right? I mean, if I could put it that way, yeah.
So I recall a very weird moment for me that really crystallized what the relationship was going to be like. It was December 2016. Duterte did his first interview with CNN Philippines, and he was asked about some recent AMTI product. And he went on a little mini rant where he said, what do I care about a think tank? It's the wrong kind of tank anyway. If Americans want to send me a tank, they can send me the other kind. And about a month after that, some support we were supposed to get from DFA magically disappeared. And I realized, okay, this is the relationship now.
Yeah, this is. And what about on the American side with the Trump administration? What did the Trump era mean for you guys in the think tank world, and particularly in CSIS, which is a bipartisan, supposedly centrist think tank?
Well, so it wasn't as I don't know, because I worked on a very specific issue and a foreign policy issue that remained important to the Pentagon. I didn't lose kind of a ton of access and influence. AMTI remained relevant, largely because the Trump White House didn't really work South China Sea issues. I mean, in his entire 4 years in office, Donald Trump never used the word South China Sea. Not once did he ever talk about
observation. That's a very good,
yeah. So it was run out
of. It's like
Duterte.
He doesn't want to talk about South China Sea.
That's right. That's right. But unlike early Duterte, from the beginning, we had cabinet officials in the U.S. who did want to talk about it. So Jim Mattis, when he was defense secretary, kept up the regular pressure on FONOPs and things like that. So we maintained a degree of influence within the government. And then when Pompeo became Secretary of State, he really elevated the issue. So by late 2019, early 2020, we were back at it. We never lost a ton of influence. There were other problems with the Trump administration, obviously. And for my colleagues at CSIS who are Republicans, I'm a Democrat, but because we're bipartisan, we tend to attract moderates from both parties, and moderate Republicans basically became men without countries during the Trump administration. So it was a lonely time to be the kind of Republican who works at CSIS.
Right. I mean, some of your colleagues were considered for ambassadorial positions, and some of it didn't pan out, right? I mean, a lot of them were very influential in normal Republican administrations, it seems, right? Okay, I don't want to get too much into the think tank politics and all. I'm sure that's not what you necessarily look forward to. Now let's talk about what we really want to talk about today, more than anything, because your book covers almost everything we want to talk about. So tell us a little bit about your book, Greg. Why did you, I know writing books are not easy. I mean, people look at me and they think I'm just like a machine, like just, churning out things, but it takes tremendous amount of passion and commitment to work on hundreds of pages that will take years before they see the light of the day, right? So what made you, let's say, masochist enough to be willing to sweat it all for this book? And what makes you feel this book is compelling and it's needed and it's really an elevation on the existing literature?
Yeah. So I started at the end of 2018, and I think it came out of a discussion I was having with one of my research associates at the time, where I
Right.
complained that I didn't think there was a good general history of the South
Right.
China Sea, particularly for Americans. I mean,
Respect that.
I think up till that point, still the recommendation that I would give anybody was Bill Hayton's 2014
Exactly.
book.
Yeah.
But I mean, the world kind of changed in the South China Sea after 2014. So Bill's book didn't include China's island building. It barely included Scarborough Shoal. And it was written very much from a China perspective.
Right.
And so my RA said, well, why don't you write it? And I thought about it. I said, why don't I write it? I've been doing this for almost 10 years. By the time I got the book out, it would be over 10 years. And so I started the book. It took about 3.5 years with two missions. One was to write that general history, and particularly write it for an American audience. I'm very aware that I'm an American. I don't think I need to write the Chinese history or the Vietnamese history of the South China Sea. My job is to write the American history. And two, I wanted to, make this not just a history book, but an IR book. So explain to American policymakers today why the South China Sea is important to the US. And I think the best way to do that was to look at why it's historically been important. If you've got certain interests that you come to time and time again for 100 years, there's a good chance that those interests are still the most relevant to your national security.
So that's like the hole you wanted to plug in. But were there like realizations or reconsiderations that you stumbled upon through the process of writing? Because that's the thing about writing, right? It's not only crystallization of what you know, but it's actually stumbling on things that were at the back of your head. I forgot the German term for that. But suddenly it's like, oh, shoot, actually this idea, I didn't really consider it, but actually that's the case. What were the eureka moments, if ever, in these 3 years of struggling to get this really important work out?
Well, one was that I had to reframe the whole argument about halfway in, because I realized that I couldn't just write a history of the South China Sea. If the goal was to highlight American interests, it had to be 3 stories at once. It had to be, yes, the history of the South China Sea, but it also had to be the history of the U.S.-Philippine alliance. And it had to be the history of the U.S. engagement with what became the Law of the Sea. So there became, I had to plug in 2 parallel chapters in the narrative just about the Law of the Sea negotiations. And then I had to work in a lot more explicit bilateral detail on the negotiations of the U.S.-Philippines, particularly the military bases agreement in the 1970s.
Yeah, speaking of the UNCLOS, I mean, the dirt that is always thrown at America, it, right? I mean, it's not ratified by the U.S. Senate. And sometimes there's even a distortion whether U.S. has even signed up to it. I mean, and you have to clarify it's different. Signing up, ratification is a Senate thing. But isn't it frustrating for you as an American to talk about UNCLOS and then you go around the world and people dish it out at you like, but you guys haven't ratified it. How can you, preach about it when you yourself are not embodying it? How did you approach that? And how do you argue around that in your book?
Well, I don't argue around it. I acknowledge that it's a self-inflicted wound. The second of the Law of the Sea chapters in the book ends with the failure of the Clinton administration to ratify, and then gives a brief history of the last attempts under the Obama administration to get ratification. And my argument today is that it can't happen in the politics of Washington. The Republican Party has gone too far to the right. Anything with the word United Nations. I mean, I think it occurred to me that we would never ratify UNCLOS, at least until there was a Democratic supermajority, the day I watched Republicans in the U.S. Congress reject the UN Charter on the Rights of the Disabled. And I thought, okay, if they reject wheelchair ramps because it had the word United Nations on it, of course they're going to reject UNCLOS.
Yeah, it's ideological.
As a matter of ideology.
Yeah.
So I don't and I do continue to make that argument, hoping that eventually the ground here in Washington will shift. But I'm also realistic that we can't sit and wait for 20 years for 70 Democrats to be in the Senate. So we have to work with what we have. I think one of the quotes I use in the book, I think I have this, but certainly I cited from the same speech, was a speech that Tommy Coe gave. I think it was upon UNCLOS entering. Right, yeah. So he was the last president of the UN Conference on the Law of the Sea. He was the one who oversaw the signing, kind of the foremost, along with Hashim Jalal, the foremost maritime law scholar in Southeast Asia. And he, from a very early point, made the argument that it's better to have an American government that doesn't ratify but effectively abides by the convention than it is to have a Chinese government that ratifies it but then ignores it.
Right. So better have de facto compliance than a situation whereby you don't have a de facto compliance but only de jure kind of compliance, which is the case of China, right? But do you think that argument resonates? Because the Chinese and the Russians and others really juice it out, right? Like America has no moral ascendancy, and all they have to do is to quote some Republicans, and the case actually makes it himself, right?
I think it resonates with those. I think it becomes a Rorschach test, right? The UNCLOS argument works against the Americans for those already predisposed to doubt American credibility and believe Chinese misinformation. And the argument against China already resonates with those predisposed to think the worst of Beijing. You're not going to convince anybody by arguing them, because there's a very clear legal argument here that UNCLOS is already customary law, that it doesn't matter if you've ratified. The ICJ and ITLAS have both ruled this time and time again, whether it's the US or Iran or Myanmar, multiple non-parties to the treaty are still bound by it. But that legal argument isn't going to convince anybody who's not already in kind of our camp, in the international law camp. And the fact is, if you're looking for an excuse to distrust the Americans and give China a pass, you'll find it.
I like the fact that you said in our camp, and then you emphasize the international legal rule of the law. Let's call it the international rule of the law camp. Can you emphasize that more? Because I think the problem for a lot of us who are doing South China Sea is at some point we're wondering, like, who are we really fighting here for? Are we fighting for our countries? Are we just fighting against China? We're fighting for something bigger, right? And in your case, you emphasize that you're fundamentally there, not only speaking as an American, but as someone who believes in a kind of international order or rule of law.
So the argument I make in the book, which is the argument that I've probably been making for decades at CSIS, is that U.S. interests in the South China Sea are fundamentally about two things that align very closely with the interests of our partners and allies. One is commitment to freedom of the seas, that UNCLOS is the most universally respected piece of treaty law since the UN Charter, and that China had as much role in writing it as anybody else. The rules haven't changed, China has changed. And if you let China get away with now violating these rules just because it has a bigger Navy than it used to, where will it stop? It will lead to the fundamental unwinding of this idea of a rules-based order in Asia in ways that are going to be very damaging, not only to all of our partners in Asia, who will suddenly find themselves living in this might makes right Chinese universe, but really to the whole international order. You can't have international law that stops at the limits of the Indo-Pacific. Second, the US has a very clear interest in its alliance commitments, which in the South China Sea means the Philippines, and in the East China Sea means Japan. And if you, as the US government, are seen as failing those commitments, it'll not only be bad for the US security network, it'll be bad for regional stability in Asia.
Right. And you say America's century in the South China Sea, but many are saying that, well, I mean, there's so many headaches for the US, right? All around the world, from Ukraine to the Persian Gulf, who knows what's going to pop up in the Indian Ocean. Don't you think that perhaps you can be accused of being too myopic? I mean, this is your forte, so obviously you're going to say this is the most important thing to America, but the reality is that America is just overstretched. And the Ukraine crisis just showed us how unstable the whole international architecture is, after all, isn't it?
I don't make the argument that the South China Sea is the only thing that matters
Or do you
to
think?
the U.S. I think that I don't make the argument that it's the most important issue necessarily for the U.S.
Mm,
I would argue that the U.S. needs to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. That
right.
it cannot, as we learned in Iraq and Afghanistan, you cannot simply fixate on one issue and hope that all the others go away. Um, the U.S. has to manage right now Russia's invasion of Ukraine and increasing tensions around Taiwan, among other things. What I will argue in the book is that the South China Sea is the area where China's violations of the established international order are the clearest. There is no argument on behalf of China's claims.
Right.
It is a clear violation of not only specific treaty law, it's a violation of the fundamental principles that underpin the rules-based order, right? What China is saying in the South China Sea is that there is no such thing as equal states, that there is one set of rules that applies to China as a big state and another set that applies to its smaller neighbors.
Right.
And if that's China's principle, then that undermines the entire regime. So I don't think there's any easy solutions in the South China Sea. I don't necessarily think that it's going to be the foremost crisis for the US at any given time. But I think because of the scale of China's claims, it is not going to fade into the background again. It will remain a top 3, top 5, maybe priority for the US and the Indo-Pacific for the foreseeable future.
Right, right. And of course, because it's also interlocking with other elements, right? The Taiwan crisis is there. There's also the East China Sea aspect, which cannot be separated from this. And then there's the whole Indo-Pacific game, right? With India, Australia, and others getting involved. So you can make a very strong argument that you cannot look at South China Sea in isolation, but you can look at it as the issue that is at the heart of multiple tectonic plates, right? And that if this moves in a certain direction, it will have ripple effects across the Indo-Pacific.
You certainly can't look at a Taiwan scenario without looking at the South China Sea. I mean, the fact that when Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan last month, not 2 months ago, she had to go around the Philippines because she couldn't safely fly over the South China Sea. Like that shows the radical shift in the status of forces, the balance of forces in the South China Sea. The fact that any Taiwan contingency, the U.S. and Japan and its allies would not have access to the South China Sea is significant. And then, yes, there are, I think, much broader implications were China to make its claims a reality. And if UNCLOS dies in the South China Sea, it dies globally. How long before the Russians want to claim historic rights in the Arctic, or Iran wants to shut the Persian Gulf anytime it wants?
Or India, for that matter, turning Indian Ocean into its own version.
Or not just India, the US, the UK, exactly. France. If the rules don't apply to China, then every other great power will decide that it's harming their interest to continue to abide by them.
Yeah, so you will have essentially balkanization of the oceans, right? And international waters, for that matter, which is horrible for everyone, and especially for smaller countries, right?
Yes, UNCLOS would become a regime that only applies to small states, because all of the big states would recognize that if they would recognize that compliance with it, in a sense, was unilateral disarmament. They were ceding to China the right to claim whatever the heck China wants, but all the rest of us are going to follow the rules, and nobody's going to do that.
Right. And going back to this issue, do you see any pattern here, any trajectory? I mean, you did history of philosophy, and we don't want to go Hegel, but of course it would be naive to say that there's a linear trajectory in history. But is there a trajectory whereby you think the Americans, throughout different administration, the broader wonkery world, are becoming more and more, let's say, aware of the nuances of the South China Sea issues and more open to more nuanced solutions or management of the crisis? And at the same time, do you also see a trajectory on the part of China of essentially moving towards turning South China Sea into a Chinese lake at some point in the near or midterm? Do you see that direction, or is it no? It's just so open-ended. You see it as a completely open-ended situation.
I think it's yes on both counts. So the U.S. government, for most of the last century, responded to the South China Sea in moments of crisis, when it was, it was distracted by something else, and then the Battle of the Paracels in '74, or John's Reef in '88, Mischief Reef in '94, and the U.S. government had to kind of come up with policy on the fly, respond to a crisis. Most recently,
Reactive.
we saw this with Scarborough Shoal and then island building. What's happened over the last 6 to 8 years has been a much more coherent establishment of US policy. Now, it might not be effective all the time. I would argue there probably is no effective way to roll back Chinese gains at the moment. The South China Sea has become a problem to be managed while we wait for Xi Jinping to leave office or regional dynamics to change. But the US has become much more deliberate and aware of its own interests and is pursuing them in a much more coherent way than it has in the past. On the Chinese side, there is a clear ratchet effect in Chinese claims. So with each step in the evolution of these disputes, they become more and more politically salient in China. Xi Jinping has amped that up to 11 by putting maritime issues at the heart of the China dream. And so there's this inability to moderate claims, to compromise, that's forcing China into a corner, right? I mean, the space for compromise for Chinese leaders has shrunk progressively over the years. And at this point, it seems like the default mode is pursuit of control over all peacetime activity in the South China Sea. And at least for the remainder of Xi's term, that's going to be the case. So we are going to continue to drift toward a de facto Chinese lake. All of this is, we know where the US stands, we know where China stands. Where does everybody else stand? Because the US, if this is it, if it's US policy versus Chinese policy, China's going to win. The South China Sea will become a Chinese lake. The Philippines will have no exclusive economic zone. Neither will Vietnam. UNCLOS will end, and so will the US-Philippine alliance. The US simply cannot do this alone. So the question is, where does the Philippines stand? Where does Vietnam stand? Where do other middle powers stand? Will the Europeans speak up more? Will the Japanese and the Australians continue to push on this issue? If there's a global coalition that imposes cost on Beijing, then I think it shapes the environment in a way that makes it more likely that China will seek face-saving compromises. But in the absence of that, I mean, if we continue on the path we've been in since, well, at least that we were on from 2016 to 2020, with kind of Southeast Asian and European partners basically saying it's up to the Americans to solve this, then it's going to be a Chinese lake. We know how that's going to end.
Yeah. And do you think that the middle powers or middle power diplomacy is also moving in the right direction? I mean, do you see the Quad? Do you see the European countries in the Pacific policies? Do you think that these are these just symbolic posturing, or do you think there's more to it and there's a lot of potential to it? And in connection to that, do you think America will be comfortable with these countries operating autonomously from it? Because, you know, the accusation usually is that, they're more or less extension of American empire. If Washington cannot do it itself, essentially contracting out these countries to do it on its behalf. What's going on there from your perspective?
So yes, I think we're seeing shifts in the right direction. So you've had the Brits, the Germans, the French all toughen their rhetorical posture on the South China Sea, clarify their legal objections to China's claims over the last 2 years. The Indonesians seem to have turned a corner after China's harassment of Indonesian oil and gas drilling. And of course, we have a Philippine government that's willing to speak honestly about what's happening in the South China Sea, which makes all of this much easier. The Indians get about as close to condemning China as they can without actually saying it and then back off. But the real trick here is, will regional claimants lead? Because there's only so far that you can realistically expect other middle powers to go. The Americans will lean forward, and so will the Japanese and the Australians. But will you get the Italians, the Swedes, will they speak up if the Philippines isn't asking them to? Of course not. And what fundamentally changed in 2016 was that the Philippines stopped asking the world to support it. And so most of the countries that in 2015 and 2016 had said that they would back the Philippines in the arbitration case didn't do that. They went back to the middle, precisely because the Duterte government didn't ask them to. And you would go around Europe, you spend more time in Europe than I do. The refrain that I constantly heard was that we can't stand up for a country that won't stand up for itself. We can't want this more than the Philippines does. So
holier than the
most important thing,
holier than the Pope. Yep.
That's right. And the most successful strategy is not like, what are the Americans going to do? is, do the Americans and the rest of the international community have somebody to stand behind? We can't stand in front of the Philippines, but we can stand behind it. As to how the Americans feel, look, I don't know that all Americans are happy with this, but I think the consensus, the realistic consensus in Washington, is that the days of American unipolarity are way behind us. If the U.S. is going to secure its national interests, it can only do so as part of a robust network of allies and partners. And the most important thing is to see those allies and partners kind of carrying more of the water themselves, which requires autonomy. The Japanese alliance, the Australian alliance, now because of Russia, the NATO alliance, are all modernizing in ways that make those partners perhaps still junior partners, but autonomous junior partners in the alliance. And they are now as important to the Americans as the Americans are to them, which just to and then I'll get off my soapbox. This is why the modernization process in the U.S.-Philippine alliance that started last year is so important. The U.S.-Philippine alliance is the one singular treaty alliance in the world for the Americans that has not modernized in that way. It's been left behind in this process of modernization. So it's very easy to talk about a more equal alliance. We need to make that concrete. And if that happens, then the Philippines will be an equal partner in this broader alliance network. And if it doesn't, then the alliance will continue to wither.
Yeah, so the Philippines has to do also its own part, aside from demanding for more assistance and reliability on the part of the Americans. I mean, in fairness to you, Greg, I mean, one thing I appreciated with your work and commentaries throughout the years is that you always also pointed out that, the ball is also in America's court, that the Americans also had some reliability signaling that they had to do. And I think perhaps we're moving in the right direction on that front. So we're heading towards the end of this interview. I want to talk to you a lot, but I know that you have other commitments and all, and it's early morning there. But what do you have a sense about the new governments that are coming up in the region, especially, of course, the Marcos Jr. administration? Is there something that surprises you with the new administration, or is there something that even makes you even more optimistic and cautiously optimistic, at least, about the direction of things, of the bilateral alliance and dealing with China in the South China Sea?
I'm,
sorry if it's a leading question almost, but
no. So I think everybody in Washington is probably pretty happy with what they've seen from the Marcos government so far. The processes that started last year with Secretaries Lorenzon and Austin meeting have continued unbroken into the new administration. The new defense guidelines, implementation of the EDCA sites, negotiating an information sharing agreement, all of this stuff that frankly we should have done 20 years ago, that we're now trying to make up for lost time.
Thanks
I read the Marcos
Trump to a certain degree, Maybe thanks to them for shocking us into action.
I mean, it might well be a comment. Yeah, I mean, it may well be that after Trump and Duterte combined with Chinese bad behavior, we realized that we kind of sleepwalked into a moment of crisis in the alliance. And for years, certainly since the VFA in '98, we've just kind of assumed that the alliance is fine as is. And now here we are in 2022 realizing that actually it's not fit for purpose at all.
Right.
And what I think what's allowing that in the Marcos administration is that it's fundamentally, this is an administration run by competent professionals, by technocrats. Having General Faustino and D&D and especially having Ambassador Manalo and DFA, who I got to meet with again a couple months ago, it makes all the difference in the world, right? Having people who speak for the institutions, and the institutions clearly recognize that Philippine national interest is best served by deepening the alliance with the Americans. But not just by deepening it with blinders on, but by forcing the Americans to also have these difficult discussions about what the alliance means.
Yeah. You think America is taking Philippines more seriously now? I'm already doing this part for my Philippine audience, right? I mean, I think we did the big picture, but now I think we want to move more to the Philippine side. Do you think America is taking the Philippines more seriously now after everything? Do you think Marcos Jr. has a unique opportunity to squeeze more out of this alliance that in itself is also going through a transition and evolution process?
Absolutely, the Americans are taking the Philippines more seriously. Is Washington taking the Philippines seriously enough?
That's the challenge.
Probably not.
Yeah.
But taking it more seriously than we have since at least the 1970s. I think, and Taiwan is only going to sharpen that. We are having we're having the kinds of discussions with each other that
Yeah.
we've never had, right? What do the Philippine government expect of the US government? What does the US government expect of the Philippine government? Where do we see eye to eye and where don't we? I mean, we don't have the answers yet, but we're actually talking to each other like equal partners, not like renter and rentee, which is how the alliance operated for so many decades.
Right. And speaking of that, I mean, do you see the ETCA, for instance, finally being operationalized the way it should have been along the lines that you have been arguing for years? I mean, are we finally moving in the right direction in terms of making this alliance as operationally, prepared as possible? Because it's not only South China Sea, right? It's also Taiwan now, which is at the back of our head. Like, good grief, right?
I think so. I mean, certainly we're seeing U.S. Indo-Pacific Command is putting more money behind the construction projects in the EDCA sites with the support of the AFP. All of that's only been happening for the last year or so, so not
Right.
even a
Yeah.
year. So, but
Yeah.
they're trying to move very quickly.
It's just
I mean,
2020.
as important as EDCA is the new defense guidelines that are being negotiated, the GSOMIA, which is the information sharing agreement, this new maritime security dialogue. All of it is, we're trying to do the kind of modernization process that we did in Japan, the U.S.-Japan alliance in the 90s.
Yeah.
We're trying to do it in about 2 years, and it took about 20 years in Japan. But that's a sign of the urgency with which I think both bureaucracies at least recognize.
Right.
And Taiwan is a key part of this because the difficult discussion here, the one that we're just beginning to have, is what is the Philippines' part in the alliance, right? Because an equitable alliance must mean that the Philippines has to, I think, credibly believe that it is as important to the Americans as the Americans are to the Philippines. Otherwise, there will always be these fears of abandonment.
Yeah.
The Japanese have made themselves key partners in the alliance. Can the Philippines do the same? And that will require the Philippines to be involved in issues that aren't the South China Sea.
Right. I mean, we have been having this debate in the region. I mean, some folks in Singapore would argue that, if war were to break out in Taiwan, practically all of ASEAN will try to keep away from it. But I said, I'm not sure about the Philippines if we're even in position to make a choice, because automatically we'll be treated as enemy targets by one side because of the American bases here. And at the same time, the Americans will automatically treat us as an R&R place at the very least, right? If not part of broader logistical operations to help Taiwan. And I think CSIS had a war game on Taiwan earlier this year, which showed that an invasion of Taiwan most likely will happen from south of Taiwan, where there's the thinnest defense by the Taiwanese. I mean, whatever angle I look at it, the Philippines will be extremely central to any Taiwan war scenario, right? God forbid, if it goes down there.
Yeah, I mean, look, let's put a very fine point on this, right? We are still dealing 10 years later with the fallout of Scarborough Shoal, the perceived American failure to be a good ally. Nobody died at Scarborough Shoal. What would it do to the U.S.-Philippine alliance if Americans were dying 50 miles from the shores of the Philippines and the Philippine government refused any and all access?
Right. That's a good point, right? Yeah. So neutrality is not an option.
And allies cannot be neutral. I mean, allies can keep some distance. They can try to maintain their own autonomy, but either we're allies or we're not. And particularly if it's taking place, within 80 kilometers of the shores of Batanes, and the Philippines wants to be an equal ally, then it has to accept that it has a responsibility to Americans, just like Americans have a responsibility to Filipinos.
I mean, because the reason I raise that is because we have a analogous situation or precedents whereby Turkey, for instance, refused its bases in the south, the Diyarbakir region, I think, to be used for Iraq invasion, right? And there was a parliamentary vote, etc. So they kind of cop out of the thing by leveraging their democratic process. And I was thinking the Philippines could play the same game, right? Or there are people are thinking, well, if Erdogan could get away with that, maybe we could get away with it. They're a NATO member after all. I'm just throwing things out at you. I mean, trying to play the devil's advocate here because
I completely get it. But I mean, look, let's be honest. If that happens, I mean, we've been having the same argument. I lay it out in the book since at least the mid 1970s. Right. The Philippine government since Marcos have been asking over and over and over about the automaticity of the U.S. defense commitment. We've heard Duterte talk about it, and now we're hearing Marcos talk about it. God forbid the U.S. Congress get involved to prevent an American response to an attack on the Philippines. Okay. And the Americans have time and time again said, no. The War Powers Act in the U.S. allows the US president vast discretion. We promised US troops would be there without a moment's thought. And now if the situation were turned around and Americans were dying, would the Philippine government really be able to say, well, no, our democratic processes allow us to stay out of it, but we still want the Americans to promise that in any situation in which Filipinos are threatened, the Americans will be there. The alliance will end in that situation. It's one thing for Philippine troops not to be involved in Iraq. It's another thing for Filipinos to sit on their hands and watch Americans that they
can see it's just across, right?
See from the shore of the Philippines being killed.
Yep.
Right.
We have naval bases there, right, in the Luzon Strait, just staring at Taiwan, right, southern Taiwan. Exactly. No, I really want to
look, none of this.
Yeah.
If I know we have to end, I'll just say, well, none of this has easy answers, obviously, but the fact that we are having this discussion is reflective of the discussions that are happening between Washington and Manila now,
right,
which are exactly the discussions we have to have. None of this is comfortable. None of it is easy, but it is the way that equal allies must talk to each other. And for too long, these are conversations that we were afraid to have in the U.S. Alliance.
Right, exactly. We're ending on this. So can you just tell us what's your stance? Is America going to be involved in if the Philippines? I mean, I have my position on this, but I'm sure people want to hear from you, your expert stance on this. Is America going to be a reliable partner if China takes an aggressive action against the Philippines in the South China Sea? I mean, imagine. Yes.
So we've all heard the public statements from multiple U.S. officials about NDT clarification. But I've heard enough U.S. officials answer the exact same way in private. That I can unreservedly say that were there a Chinese attack, an unprovoked Chinese use of force that killed Filipinos, and the Philippine government asked for a U.S. response under Article 5, the Philippine government would get it. I'm quite confident in saying that.
Right.
Now, that said, that is entirely reliant on a U.S. belief that the Philippines will also do its part under the alliance, which includes Philippine modernization and granting of access under Article 2 of the treaty. So that could change. If 10 years from now, we're back to a neo-Duterte government where the Americans have no access and Filipino officials are asking the Americans to respond from Guam, the Americans might say, we can't, we're too far away. But as long as the Philippines does its part, yes, I'm quite confident that the Americans will do theirs.
Well, neo-Duterte, we might have another Duterte in 5 years actually from now, right? That's as things are standing, right? If not early.
Well, that one seems more pragmatic than the old one.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, just to be fair. Now, just wanted... to end on this note, I mean, thank you so much. I know we're way above time. My problem is the more question I ask you, the more I can think about ways to push you. I can see you keeping your answers very short. Sorry if I'm abusing you, Greg, but this has been really a fascinating discussion. And I realize 1 hour is actually not enough to discuss your wonderful book. Can you plug in again the title of your book for people who are interested and where they can access it all around the world?
It's called On Dangerous Grounds, America's Century in the South China Sea. It's currently available in hard copy in the US and Canada. Right. Should be available the rest of the world in November, I think, although the publisher, I mean, COVID can be weird, but if not, it's certainly available on Kindle.
Right, and Amazon, etc. So please access it. Now, you called it Dangerous Ground. What keeps you awake at night? I might want to ask those questions of 3 a.m. questions, but what is the scariest scenario that you think is more than just fantastical, that is actually quite probable in the near future or medium term?
That we're going to wake up tomorrow and find out that the Chinese killed a bunch of Philippine officials aboard a BFAR resupply mission to the Sierra Madre.
You think it's probable? It's not just fantastical?
I think that the way the Chinese behave and the number of boats they put out there makes it pretty much a mathematical guarantee that there will be another Jim Bear-like incident sooner or later, and eventually it'll involve a Philippine government vessel, which will invoke an MDT commitment.
So this is the trajectory thing. And the last question, maybe on a more positive note, is there something that gives you some cautious element of hope that we might avoid not only the worst, but we might realize the value of what you have been arguing, which is we need an international rule of law. Otherwise, we're all going to be hung apart.
Yeah, look, nobody's accepted the 9-dash line. China does still want global leadership, which means that its incentives can be shaped And Xi Jinping will not live forever.
Okay, on that note, maybe we should get back to you after November and all. Thank you so much, Gregory Pauling, a very good friend, a leading expert on South China Sea. I had no idea you have a China background. That explains a lot. And I could see you're so passionate about Southeast Asia, about Philippine-US alliance more than anyone I know in DC circles. I mean, no offense to other friends. So thank you so much for your dedication and support. And congratulations on your new book, your latest book, On Dangerous Ground, America's Century in the South China Sea by Gregory Pauling. So please grab a copy, and looking forward to catch up with you in person and online and other formats to talk more about this topic, because 1 hour really was not enough. Thank you so much, Greg, and have a lovely day there in Baltimore, right? Baltimore, yep.
That's great. Thank you, Richard. Have a great night.
Good night. Adios.